What is up guys, Photo Fever here, and today we are reviewing Canon's new ultra-wide angle prime lens, the Canon RF 16mm f2.8. And I'm going to start right now. What is up guys, Photo Fever here, and welcome back to the channel. Now, a couple of months ago, Canon released 3 new products. They obviously released the highly anticipated Canon EOS R3, but they also surprised us with 2 new RF lenses, the Canon RF 100-400, as well as this lens we have here, the RF 16mm f2.8. Now, these lenses were a bit of a surprise and they weren't rumoured at all, and it was really interesting to see Canon releasing an ultra-wide angle prime lens. They haven't done one of these in ages. So let's go and have a look at how well this lens performs in my tests. So the first thing I want to talk about, guys, is the overall build quality and the design of this lens. Now, you might pick this lens up and think, I've seen this lens before, and you're right, it isn't deja vu. This lens is pretty much identical to the RF 50mm f1.8, which got released last year. In fact, I've got this lens here, the 50mm f1.8 versus the 16, and if we put them side by side, they are pretty much identical. There's only really one distinguishing factor. This says 50mm on the front, and this says 16. They've pretty much copied the actual design of the 50mm for the 16mm, which isn't a bad thing. They've done it because, firstly, there's nothing wrong with the 50mm design. I thought it was really small, compact, nice and lightweight. But also, they've done it to save a little bit of money, which then they can pass on to the consumer. This isn't a very expensive lens, so any way they can cut costs is a really good way of saving money and then passing that on to make a nice cheap lens like this. Now, they've only got one button on the side, so it's not an automatic manual focus button. In fact, it's a focus control switch. Because you've got the actual control ring on the front here. Obviously, when you're in manual mode, it will control the focus, but when you're in automatic mode, you can actually switch that over to control, and you can actually change custom features within the camera. So I've got mine connected to white balance when I'm using Kelvin. So I can actually increase or decrease the temperature of my photos just by the control ring. And you can do that with pretty much all RF lenses to date. So overall, I really like the build quality of this. The only downside is it doesn't really offer weather sealing, and it isn't the best well-made lens I've tested, especially when you look at any of the RF lenses. For instance, the RF 100-500mm has got a lot better build quality than this, but obviously it's a lot more expensive. So actually, I'm going to give it the exact same score that I gave the RF 50mm. I'm going to be giving it an overall score of 7 out of 10. So the next thing I want to have a closer look at is the image quality of this lens. Now, firstly, this lens is quite a cheap lens, so I don't expect miracles. It's also an ultra wide angle prime lens with a fairly wide aperture of f2.8. So I'm also expecting quite bad distortion and quite bad vignetting. But how bad? Let's go and have a look at a few sample images I took at Old Warden in Bedfordshire. So I headed over to Old Warden in Bedfordshire that also has a plane museum, but it's also got the Swiss Gardens, which has a plethora of plant species across the entire world. So you've got things from conifers all the way to giant sequoia trees, which are found in California. Now, I thought this would be a great place to test this 16mm for landscape photography. And I must say, it really did stand up to the test. I was really happy with a lot of the images. Now, I usually don't shoot 16mm because of how wide angle it is. It's very difficult to shoot because you've got to think about the entire composition. The wider you go, the more composition and perspective you have to take into consideration. But overall, I thought this lens scored really highly in my tests, although I did find the sharpness in the corners was a little bit of a concern, but we'll discuss that when we have a look at some of the graph images. But overall, I thought the colors were really nice. I thought the contrast was really, really good. And overall, I really liked shooting 16mm. I must say, it's definitely changed my mind on shooting wide angle. So if we go and have a look at the first graph image, so this was shot at 16mm at f2.8, so this is wide open for this lens. If we go ahead and zoom into the center, you can see how sharp this lens truly is. I would say it's as sharp as the RF 50mm in the center. But if we go ahead and zoom over to the corners, you'll notice they'll get noticeably softer with a reduction in contrast. And also, I would say they are slightly darker as well. So there is definitely vignetting creeping in. But if we have a look again at the whole image, you'll notice there is very little chromatic aberration, which is really good. And I would say the colors are represented really cleanly in this photo. So if you go ahead and step down to f4, you'll notice the overall brightness of the photo is a lot more consistent. If we go ahead and zoom into the center, you can see the sharpness is still there, even at f4. And then if we go ahead over to the corners, you'll notice they are noticeably sharper than f2.8. So that is definitely an increase there. Then if we go ahead and step down to f5.6, you'll notice that the vignetting has almost completely disappeared, but the sharpness has got better in the center and in the corner. And then I would say the same is for f8. Anything beyond f8 though, you will notice a change. So if you go ahead and step down to f11, you'll notice the corner has got a little bit softer, same with the edges. And then if we go ahead and step down to f16, it's the same story. And then f22 is very soft throughout the entire image frame. That's just due to diffraction, and most lenses will suffer from it. So now let's go and have a look at distortion and vignetting. So the first graph image here is a corrected photo in camera shot at 16mm wide open at f2.8. Now the reason for this is you cannot turn off distortion correction in camera, which is not a good sign. So we'll see what that's like when we turn it off in the camera raw filter. But overall, I thought the actual distortion wasn't too bad wide open, but you can see there is slight vignetting. So let's go ahead and turn that distortion correction off.
Holy moly!
Oh my goodness, that is way worse. So you can see there is very heavy barrel distortion, but the actual vignetting is the same. Then if we go ahead and step down to f4, the vignetting is slowly disappearing, but that distortion is not going anywhere. This distortion is very bad, and by far the worst distortion of any lens that I have tested. Then if we go ahead and step down to f5.6, the image is a lot more consistent, so the overall brightness is a lot better, which means there's little vignetting. And then if we go ahead and step down to f8, there is no vignetting to be found, but that distortion remains, and that is very bad distortion. But you have to turn it off in the camera raw filter. It's not something you can turn off in camera, which I suppose is a good sign. So overall, I was actually really impressed by the quality of the images that I took. I'm not a massive fan of ultra wide angle prime lenses. I find that distortion is really bad. I also find sometimes the actual vignetting can sometimes really impede the quality of the photos. But I thought this handled it quite well. Obviously, there's a lot of post-processing happening in camera to actually fix the photos. You can't actually turn the distortion off, but if you go into the camera raw filter and then turn it off, you can see how bad that distortion really is. But overall, if you ignore that, because obviously you can't technically turn it off in camera, so you're stuck with the presets that's built in, I thought the actual image quality was really good. I thought the brightness was really nice. I thought the aperture worked really nice in low light conditions. But I also thought the sharpness and contrast in the center made this lens stand out from the crowd when you have a look at other lenses of similar price point. So overall, I'm going to be giving it a 7 out of 10 for image quality. So the next thing I want to talk about, guys, is the size and weight of this lens. And this lens is tiny. Look at the size of it. It is absolutely perfect if you're a travel photographer. I think if you got the 16mm and the 50mm, you're pretty much covered for all types of photography. You got your 16mm for your nice wide angle landscape shots, but if you want to do some portrait shots, you can go over to the 50mm, and both of them are absolutely tiny. So this is really good to see from this lens. Now, there is a slight weight difference, although it's only 5 grams. The Canon 16mm f2.8 comes in at 165 grams, where the Canon 50mm f1.8 comes in at 160 grams. So there's only a 5 gram difference. But if we went to go and have a look at a few other lenses with similar focal lengths, Canon don't make another ultra wide angle prime lens. So we're gonna have a look at the Canon RF 14 to 35mm f4, a lot darker aperture, but it does have a zoom which is a little bit handier. That comes in at 540 grams. So it's about almost 5 times heavier. So it is definitely a small lens. The only other lens I can think about comparing it to is the Sigma 14mm. Now this is a lot brighter aperture, and it's also made of metal, so it means it's going to be a lot heavier, and it definitely is a lot heavier, coming in at over 1 kilo at 1,170 grams. So this lens is an absolute steal if you're a landscape photographer that doesn't want to carry around a lot of weight, or if you're a travel photographer. I think either one of those, this lens is going to be perfect as it's always going to fit in your camera bag. So because of that, I'm going to be giving it the full marks, the 10 out of 10. So the next thing I want to talk about is the focus motor and image stabilization. And what is this lens like for using it for video? Well, let's start off with the image stabilization. It has none, but that's no surprise. Ultra wide angle prime lenses usually don't. If you are wanting a lens with image stabilization, then I'll definitely recommend the 14 to 35mm or the 15 to 35mm RF lenses. Both of these lenses, because they are zooms, have image stabilization. Now, obviously, if you've got a Canon R5 or R6, you've also got IBIS, which is in-body image stabilization. So you can actually use that in camera as in tandem with a prime lens to get nice, smooth shots without relying on the optical stabilization of a lens. You do have the option of optical stabilization in the zoom, but it's not a deal breaker nowadays because of the IBIS of most cameras. So let's move on to the focus motor. Now, this has Canon's cheaper STM or stepping motor system. Now, it does come in and out when you zoom closer and further away, but it is quite a loud focus motor. It isn't the quietest I've ever used it. So if you're using it for video, I would definitely recommend an external microphone or a lavalier microphone like I've got on at the moment. But overall, I thought the image quality when it comes to video was really good, but the sound of this did let it down a little bit. And obviously it doesn't have image stabilization whatsoever. So because of that, I'm only going to be giving it an 8 out of 10 because it isn't the perfect lens for video, but it is quite good if you don't use the microphone. And last but most importantly is the price. How well is this lens priced versus the competition? Well, again, this is another where you're going to be pleasantly surprised. This lens performed really well in my tests, and to think it only comes in at £319. Now that is £100 more than the Canon RF 50mm. That lens comes in at £219. So both of these lenses, if I get them out again, the 16mm and the 50mm, they are pretty much the same in almost every way. There's only £100 between them. So if you are a travel photographer or a landscape photographer that wants to do a little bit of portrait as well, then this combination is going to be really, really good. Both small, both lightweight, and you can get them both for basically £500, which is really, really good value for money. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be perfect. Again, there are issues with image quality, but for the price, I think it's really, really well suited. So let's go and have a look at a few other lenses on the market to compare it versus price. So if we go and have a look at the Sigma 14mm, this comes in at a whopping £1,399. So if you are more interested in ultra wide angle photos and you're after better image quality, I'd recommend the Sigma lens, but the price is to boot. It is a very expensive and very heavy lens. And the only other lens that I can realistically compare it to is the Canon 14 to 35mm f4 lens. Now, this is a really handy zoom lens. Grant you, not the best aperture of f4, and that comes in at £1,749. So overall, this lens here is an absolute steal at £319. So because of that, I'm going to be giving it a 9 out of 10 for price. So now let's move on to the pros and cons of this lens to really find out, is this lens worth a spot in your camera bag? So let's go and have a look at the pros of buying this lens. So firstly, this lens has got an incredibly bright aperture of f2.8, which is really handy and really good for low light situations. This lens is also really good for macro photography with a minimum focus distance of just 13 centimeters. This lens has also got really good sharpness in the center. Grant you, the corners are quite soft due to the distortion fixing that happens in post-camera, but I would say the center of the photo is pin sharp. This lens is also really small and lightweight, which is great if you're a travel or landscape photographer that doesn't want to hunk around a massive lens. And then lastly, this lens is really cheap, just coming in at £399, just £100 more than the cheapest lens on the market, the RF 50mm. So let's balance it out by having a look at a few of the cons and why you shouldn't buy this lens. Now, this lens does not offer weather sealing, which could be an issue if you're a landscape photographer, if it ever gets wet or dusty. Do think about that if you're bringing it in the great outdoors. This lens has also got quite soft corners just due to the distortion fixing. This lens isn't great if you're after corner to corner sharpness, although it does have sharpness in the center. Again, reverting back to the previous one, this lens has very bad distortion. So do bear that in mind. If you're after less distortion, maybe choose a different lens with a slightly narrower focal length. This lens has also got quite bad vignetting. Just due to the distortion, it adds to that vignetting, and also because of the aperture of f2.8. So overall, I think this lens is really, really good. I think the price point is perfect for a lot of beginner photographers that want to get into landscape photography, but I also think it's really good just due to the size and weight. I also thought the image quality was really, really good, with the obviously amazing bonus of that aperture. It is really good if you're wanting a prime lens that's really good for low light photography. I'm not someone that likes shooting a lot of wide angle prime shots. The most widest angle lens I personally own is just a Sigma 24mm. So now owning the 16mm, it offers a completely different aspect, and you really have to think about composition and perspective. So let's go and have a look at the final results. So overall, this lens scored quite high with a score of 42 out of 50, which is a highly recommended lens to have in your camera bag. I would also highly recommend this lens if you're interested in a very small travel lens. Again, if you get that 60mm and 50mm, that is a perfect combination if you don't want to carry around a lot of lenses, but you also want great image quality. I think both of these lenses are going to be found in most camera bags from here on out. And there we are. There is my lens review of the Canon RF 16mm f2.8. Now, if you found this video informative or it helped you out, make sure to give it a like and a share if you know anyone that wants to buy this lens. Also, if you want to learn more about Photoshop, Lightroom, and everything photography related, start now by subscribing and hitting the bell so you guys don't miss anything. Now, if you want to learn more about Photoshop, I've actually got my latest playlist just up here. Or if you want to have a look at more lens reviews, because I've reviewed quite a few lenses to date, I've got my playlist just down here. But until next time, guys, keep creating.